The rain had turned the streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, into a mirror when Nathaniel saw the woman he had spent 5 years trying not to remember sitting alone on a bench outside a small church, her face buried in her hands. He almost drove past. Then she lifted her head, and the expression on her face stopped him cold. It wasn't the anger he remembered, or the pride that had once pushed them apart. It was the exhausted sadness of someone who had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long. Nathaniel pulled his car over, stepped into the rain, and walked toward his ex-wife, Rebecca, without knowing that the reason she was crying would completely change the way he understood their divorce, their past, and the woman he had never truly stopped loving. If you believe that kindness, hope, forgiveness, compassion, and second chances can change a person's life, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us that sometimes love deserves another chance. 5 years earlier, Nathaniel and Rebecca had ended their marriage after years of quiet disappointment. They had not separated because of one terrible betrayal or a dramatic event. Their marriage had simply become a place where two tired people stopped listening to each other. Nathaniel worked long hours as an electrical contractor, believing that providing a comfortable life was the same as being present. Rebecca had worked at a community library, quietly supporting their home while feeling increasingly invisible. Arguments became shorter, silences became longer, and eventually they signed papers that neither of them truly understood emotionally until it was too late. Nathaniel moved to another part of Iowa, threw himself into work, and convinced himself that moving forward meant leaving the past untouched. Rebecca remained in Cedar Falls, living quietly and rarely contacting him. They had exchanged only a handful of messages over 5 years, mostly polite wishes on birthdays and holidays. Now, standing in front of her in the rain, Nathaniel felt the distance of those years collapse in a single moment. Rebecca tried to wipe her face and insisted she was fine, but Nathaniel knew her well enough to recognize that particular expression. He offered to drive her home, and after a long hesitation, she accepted. During the ride, she stared through the window while the windshield wipers swept back and forth. Nathaniel noticed an envelope clutched tightly in her hands. He did not ask about it until they reached her small house. Inside, the place looked different from the home they had once shared. There were shelves of books, small plants near the windows, and framed photographs of community events. Rebecca had built a life without him, but something about the silence inside the house felt strangely heavy. Finally, she placed the envelope on the kitchen table. It contained a letter from the hospital informing her that her father, Arthur, needed a complicated heart procedure and that the cost would be far beyond what she could comfortably manage. Nathaniel immediately understood why she had been crying, but Rebecca surprised him by revealing that the medical bills were not the only reason. Her father had spent years regretting the way he had treated Nathaniel during their marriage. Arthur had been convinced that Nathaniel was neglecting Rebecca and had often encouraged her to leave him. But after the divorce, he discovered how wrong he had been. Nathaniel had quietly paid several of Rebecca's old debts without telling anyone, believing it was the least he could do after failing to save their marriage. Arthur had eventually learned about it, and the guilt had followed him for years. Rebecca then revealed something Nathaniel never expected. For 5 years, she had kept a box filled with letters she had written to him but never sent. Every time she wanted to tell him she missed him, she wrote a letter and placed it in the box instead. She had been too afraid to reopen the wounds between them. The tears outside the church were not simply about her father's illness. She had just decided that if something happened to her father, she would regret never telling Nathaniel the truth about how much she still cared for him. Nathaniel sat quietly, overwhelmed by the realization that both of them had spent years believing the other had moved on. They had each mistaken silence for indifference. They had allowed pride to speak for them when their hearts were begging for honesty. He did not promise that everything could suddenly become perfect. Instead, he offered to help Rebecca through her father's treatment, not as her husband, not because he expected anything in return, but because after everything they had shared, he could not walk away from someone who had once been his family. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Nathaniel accompanied Rebecca to appointments, helped organize paperwork, and spent evenings repairing little things around her house. Arthur's procedure went well, and during his recovery, he finally apologized to Nathaniel for judging him so harshly. Nathaniel accepted the apology, not because the past no longer mattered, but because he had learned that forgiveness was not about pretending pain never existed. It was about refusing to let yesterday control tomorrow. Months later, Nathaniel and Rebecca stood together in the same little church where he had found her crying. They were not rushing back into marriage. They were starting again carefully, honestly, and with the wisdom that only painful years could teach. Rebecca had stopped hiding her feelings, and Nathaniel had learned that love was not measured by how hard a person worked to provide, but by how willing they were to listen, stay, and show up when life became difficult. One evening, Rebecca handed Nathaniel the old box of unsent letters. He smiled when he realized there were dozens of them. Instead of reading them immediately, he held her hand and told her they could open them together, one at a time, whenever they were ready. For the first time in 5 years, neither of them was afraid of what the future might hold. Sometimes people don't stop loving each other. Sometimes they simply stop knowing how to reach one another. And sometimes life gives two people a second chance, not to erase the past, but to build something wiser from it. If this story touched your heart, please support it with a like, share it with someone who believes in forgiveness, and subscribe if you want more stories about hope and second chances. And before you leave, tell us in the comments, do you believe some relationships deserve a second chance after years apart? Nathaniel and Rebecca's story reminds us that love is not always about finding someone new. Sometimes, it is about finally seeing the person who was there all along, and choosing, with a wiser heart, to begin again.